When a game developer is shut down, there are realistically only a few avenues that could possibly be taken. For Evolution Studios, it might have initially appeared as if they were more fortunate than most. But by the end, their position would be just as unenviable as the one they found themselves in the first place. The future, for what was left of Evolution Studios, was completely open. And a round of pints down the local, what came next wasn't looking too far away. Evolution Studios have found themselves in a very difficult place. Sony wanted ubiquity. This appeared in the form of third-person adventure with heavy story, or at the very least, to work in a very similar structure or framework. It was a tough crowd and the standards were hard to match for a studio who usually made racing games. The perfect demonstration of this mindset is a demonstration in of itself. E3 2018. One cursory look at this presentation and the 4 games they put front and center, and I am a drunkard and a fool, but even I can see 2 of these games might as well be the exact same. And that is not to speak on their quality, not necessarily, but it's really not that difficult to understand why Evolution was shut down when seeing what foot they put forward with these games. In an odd way, the cinematic camera moments of MotorStorm Apocalypse bore a resemblance to the trend of the, rather reductively called movie games made popular by the PlayStation exclusive Uncharted 2 Among Thieves. Trends aren't inherently bad and neither is following them. It just has to fit the game in question. Uncharted is a fantastic series, and unlike most games that tried to follow its example, it really did work for Apocalypse. They didn't exactly get lucky because it was always their intention to make that style of game. But what about when it isn't the developer's intention, it's the publisher's? This is ultimately the case for Drive Club. Expecting this game, that on its own terms is utterly fantastic, to compete with the likes of Gran Turismo for a myriad of reasons, be they brand recognition, development costs, game direction, or just plain old inspiration. This was never going to work. Attempting to brand something as a so-called Forza killer, well, that's a pretty bad way to start a conversation. Drive Club was not Gran Turismo, and its developer never wanted it to be. More than perhaps anything else, though, it was Drive Club's server issues that had ultimately sealed its fate, and unfortunately, its developers too. It was nothing but tragic when those who had spearheaded some of racing's most illustrious series, and one that certainly would have been, is thrown aside simply to cut costs. But unlike Sony, there was one party in particular who not only saw their talent, but an opportunity. Codemasters, creating racing games as early as the late 80s, and establishing a tone with the classic Micro Machines. They have an extensive history even outside of racing games, but in the more modern age they're known for games like Colin McRae's Dirt or the F1 series, or Toka and what eventually became Grid. To say they're a staple is to sell it short. During the 6th and 7th generation they had a ubiquity of their own, because they simply couldn't be avoided. Knowing that legacy and even predicting a little of its future, it makes total sense. It's especially funny to think about the crossing streams, as it were. With MotorStorm, Codemasters had their own answer with Dirt Showdown. And with Micro Machines, Evolution had their own answer with MotorStorm RC. The difference here when it comes to, say, copying someone's homework is the Dirt Showdown isn't a shitty game. But that doesn't matter. Point is, it's an ideal fit. Codemasters, or Codies, have a vice-like grip on the racing industry, and it's not hard to see why. Let it be said and let it be known, this is a hollow time for arcade racing games. Shit, even just racing games in general. It's hard not to be famished. The games they've been tending to make around this time definitely held towards the more simulation feel. But that is not a failure. Haha, that's an opportunity. With the supremacy they hold around what could honestly be considered their genre, With this newly acquired classic developer, whose footing was usually placed within the arcade, why not carve out a new piece of land? What action racing games are left? Shit. What arcade racing games are even left? The market's so untapped to be like selling whiskey to an Irishman. Or me. I'm so fucking parched at this point. I'd even drink Johnny Walker Black Label. Which, in this overextended analogy, is probably something like, I don't know, Pac-Man Rally? Oh, yeah, I should also mention that Need for Speed is probably the only big arcade racing game at this point in time, and it's still doing its madly fluctuating in quality thing.
You should say it.
No, I don't want to say it.
Say it.
Good game. Fucked it up.
Thank you.
All this to say, this game could stand out easily. And that game? I was happy with something traditional, but holy shit did they blow predictability out the fucking water. Now, is there overlap to what they've done before? I mean, sure, yeah, but wow, they got the old noggin jogging and just started punching in wild fucking directions. And that is not to say it's bad, it's good even, really fucking good in some places. It's just I would have loved to have been there when they pitched this shit. It's like Rockstar Games making a table tennis. Oh shit, that happened, didn't it? Well, then maybe it's like taking the classic isometric RPG in Syndicate and turning it into a basic middle-of-the-road first-person shooter. Yeah, that definitely didn't happen. Point is, it's certainly different. I say action racing game, but at least one of those descriptors could go.
Game?
No. Wait a minute. What did I call the next section? Probably should have changed that. No, this isn't exactly like Evolution making Doom or something, though I would pay to see that. But wow, this is quite a bit different from what I'd expect from a racing game. From kill cams to callouts, it is abundantly clear they're coming for a sweet piece of that Call of Duty ass. It doesn't have any hit markers, but the comparison is noticeable. Getting into Onrush ain't difficult. The game's first impression is very welcoming, in fact. There's lots of familiar, like boosting and a generous third-person camera, as well as just the vehicle and the outward stretching track themselves. But there is also a lot of new, like a team lineup indicator and point counters, and most notably, more of an emphasis on vehicle-to-vehicle violence. This very mode that this is being played within is not a race or a time trial. It's something entirely new to this form. This, for the most part, is the breadth of the experience. And for better or for worse, the first few hours are easily the most engrossing. It is car combat, but not so much in a Twisted Metal or Carmageddon way with open levels and more of a player-dictated pace. Bizarrely, it's aiming more at, fighting games. Yeah, the rounds are generally shorter and not an instant win, and I suppose, at times, I guess combos? Now the other side of this is hero shooters. Huh. Okay, that does check out. Specific class-based abilities and even the idea of a team. It's more like Overwatch on 4 wheels. What the fuck? The game is not attempting to be a racing game, at least not exclusively, which is fine. There are plenty of games, Crazy Taxi, Smuggler's Run, even Vin Diesel's Wheelman. They found a niche within some parameters of what would usually be considered a racing game, and they kind of told their own story with it. I don't have a problem with it at all. The game never makes a concession about being an untraditional experience, and I just really fucking appreciate that. No awkward sandwiching within a pre-existing franchise. This is not your grandpa's Master Chief. No, this is just bad. This is an action racing game with perhaps a capitalized A and a lowercase r. Aiming more in the direction of an SSX style of racing has done wonders for originality, but largely how the game plays. The peaks and valleys approach of constant climbing and falling is very engaging. In fact, looking to outside genres so freely is incredibly refreshing, especially in the drought of 2018 racing titles. It certainly isn't some desert mirage, but I'd be lying to say the Oasis wasn't different to what I imagined beyond the sand's flickering haze. Before I dig my grave a little too deeply though, I think it's time I run through the weapons of choice. There are 8 unique classes separated between 4 different scales. Each one plays with a moderate difference in the hopes it's a meaningful choice. Time to crack open a few cold ones. Blade! For the motherfuckers who are always trying to ice skate uphill. The first bike of the bunch, and as expected, not particularly strong. Definitely fast enough though, even if slightly slower than Outlaw. I don't know, it's negligible. Where this class really excels, however, is in its rush ability. Firewall. And oh, my god, as an introduction, it is so powerful. It's probably the best in the game. It's an instant kill. It's like the light trail from Tron. Yeah, good luck driving behind this shit. It lifts a fairly modest class into the upper echelon. It's like Revenge of the fucking Nerds or something. Oh yeah, it's got this blinding crash tag too. So extra salt in the wound. Crash bang? Flashbang? Oh, come on! Outlaw! The second bike, and a very traditional one at that. Probably the most sane of the bunch. Probably. The Drain ability is not fun to play as or against. It's entirely passive in a way this game really doesn't accommodate for. Nothing about this particular vehicle is exceptional, except there is one very good reason to use this class. Slam. Because holy Toledo, what a fucking ability. The amount of takedowns just from this causing a ruckus, it's beautiful. It's just beautiful. Vortex. And the first of the 4-wheeled vehicles, and this is definitely the best all-rounder. From its quick, sharp turns to its small stature, it keeps this vehicle under the radar, and a reliable choice. That is also to say that the turbulence ability is intensely useful, really fucking with others with its concussive wave. This class, it gets an okie dokie from me. Charger. Vortex has a better rush ability, but the Charger is definitely more useful moment to moment. Its rush ability, being Bulldoze, is a bit weak, at least more than it should be anyhow. It's all somewhat standard fare, but the extra magnetism in the air, it almost makes the game a little too easy. Because for a moment, the missile knows where it is at all times. It knows this because it knows where it isn't. By subtracting where it is from where it isn't, or where it isn't from where it is, whichever is greater, it obtains a difference or deviation. The guided Interceptor. It knows what it wants, and what it wants is to eat. The Rampage ability rewards more rush for each successive takedown. This is balanced out because rush burns quick on this class. It is very much the monkey C button, monkey press button, big shit go boom class, but I don't know, it's a fine choice. With that name, they knew what they were doing. Dynamo. Probably most shitty. Not bad, just unspecial. It's predominantly a team-based vehicle with a resupply ability in a game that isn't nearly as team-based as it thinks it is. Boost from teammate proximity is fine. It keeps it in the race well enough, but the boost does burn fast. I say shitty, but it is reliable. It's just simply a bit boring. The choice between the Interceptor is not difficult. Titan. A fitting name for the shit Bane was juicing with. It's a heavy fucking class, and it makes it defensive by nature, but combative? Oh, it is scary. The Blockade Rush, it's useful, definitely effective, but there's no input. It's just not as satisfying as other ability. It certainly has its uses, but this truck's better in the day-to-day than it is in a specific context. Probably fuck up Batman too. And finally, there's Enforcer. Another biggin', and this one gains rush from fodder takedowns. And that might just be the strongest passive ability in the entire game. Swatting flies left and right is a hobby in this game, and this one only gets more for doing it. It also has Shutdown, which disables the boost of the other races. And fuck me, is this so strong. In a game that's meant to be about constant movement, this is a real slap to the nads. However, the rush ability Blackout, again, there's no input. In a lobby with a reaction from a real human being, hilarious. But these clowns, no banter. I doubt it does anything to AI at all. That probably will become a problem later, but even still, Enforcer's a damn good choice. Evo are no stranger to multiple vehicle classes, and the 8 that are seen here, whilst not wildly different from each other, like there are no planes or boats or anything, I think it's a real good lineup. No class is outright useless. Some are certainly better than others, but all are fun to use in their own way. They all have 3 layers of ability each, a passive, a special, and the rush. Passives are effectively slight modifiers, like more boosts from barrel rolls or near misses. The special abilities are slightly more elaborate, like dropping boost power-ups for the teammates to use. Some are quite understated, but some can be really effective. The rush ability, of course, is easily the most powerful of the bunch, resembling that of a full-stop fuck you to anybody else in the way. They're fun and powerful and a bit of an instant win. There's not a lot of strategy. It's like lobbing that big purple orb in Destiny or something. Some require timing, like waiting for enough enemy vehicles to surround so they can start sapping the boost, or just turning a very narrow part of the track into an absolute kill box. Others, on the other hand, are just easy, and will do a perfectly adequate job of fucking up anybody's day. This is already starting to look a little bit like an ugly street fight, but of course, we can always make it look more like a pitched battle. That is where the fodder comes in. And if there could ever be a more fitting name for these fucks, I don't know. I've certainly not seen it, because after all, if I'm the canon, they are, yeah. They don't have any allegiance to any of the 6 on each of the teams, they're just happy to be there. Which is ironic really, because they end up looking like ants under a magnifying glass. The fodder can be easily taken down, but it isn't masochistic, because they're meant to give boost, keep the player moving. The system is almost very close to traffic checking. They didn't go all the way, of course, that might be a little too chaotic. But their purpose is simply to die. No fodder means no boost. And at its best possible points, it feels like a barrage, a constant stream of action. There are moments, however, where it feels less like a streak, as it should, and more like waiting for the devs to throw a bone. I know this is done to make the system feel like it has a bit more strategy, but it's noticeable when there is so much going on in this game, when there simply isn't. This feels like a particularly good time to mention the game's biggest ace in the deck, the Stampede. It's an age-old idea. What happens when the player crashes, or gets crashed into? Do they just respawn? This is of course meant to appear as a little bit of a punishment, but what if it was something different? What if that wasn't the intention? What if the idea was to keep the action constantly moving? The only timers are of a respawn variety, and not falling behind is an absolute necessity. This works a lot less than a simple crash and recover, and more like a zone. A particular zone that all these entities exist within. And if they fall out of it, they simply put straight back in. The zone moves with the track and really moves with the players. And as far as this Stampede idea goes, it does its job remarkably well. Whilst there might be a few specific instances where the system falls a little bit apart, mostly they've innovated and delivered on a mechanic beautifully. That being said, when the game breaks its rule, it is glaring. Easily the biggest problem with this system is not actually the gameplay itself, but the limits placed upon it. The wait times after respawning are just stupid. There's no quick way to restart. I have to watch the rec cam, wait for the respawn, then I can hit the start menu to restart the race. It's just so needlessly tedious. Either it's constant action, or it is typical respawning, and the biggest issue is that they're too afraid to just let the brakes off. What I'll say is that Onrush feels less like a game that is let down by one very large issue, and more sort of a death by 1,000 cuts. The experience is mostly uncustomizable, and as much as I like to say that wouldn't cause a problem in the late game, it causes a problem in the early game. As much as that Stampede concept is usually delivered upon quite well, there are more than a few places where it becomes obvious that the system is hampering a bit of the gameplay. The game has a noticeable cap on top speed. There isn't a speedometer to clearly differentiate, but it is felt in the gameplay. This is mainly because if there was a speedometer, it wouldn't move. Trying to speed up sometimes, especially with some of the larger vehicles, just feels so annoyingly fucking desperate. Vehicles lose an obvious amount of speed high up in the air or when repeating jumps. This is to say there isn't really a present velocity. One nice mechanical touch the game puts in is by having a boost surge when landing a jump, but ultimately it's negligible because it reaches that speed cap all the same. Speed, outside of mechanics anyway, is visualized kind of strangely. The sense of speed is pretty good, but it can be hard to tell with others, especially when they're slightly behind, but still in the periphery, how close they actually are or how much of a threat they represent. Still, there isn't much motion blur, and I do appreciate that. There are two cameras, both in the third person. One is close, and one is not close. Fuck me. But they do their job well, and they both have some pretty neat tricks. The camera tilts slightly when in the air after a jump, and it is really cool. It can do have a little bit more tilt to show more of a trajectory, especially what's below the player, but for the most part it's a nice touch, and it certainly doesn't make the game too easy. The camera during a takedown is especially nice. The first time I saw it and when that slow motion kicked in, I almost sullied my drawers, but it can be a little bit too disorienting. I've had plenty of crashes simply because the game had to wrestle control away and I couldn't tell which way my car was going. This is another aspect where the uncustomizable shit starts to feel a little bit tedious. Something like this should definitely be an option. That does speak to the emphasis on violence in Onrush though, because Maron! If it's swatting flies or tipping cows, it just feels really fucking good. There are slight differences in how it's visualized between the fodder and the players, but for the most part it all feels really fucking tight. It works as it should, and it is mostly very satisfying, but there are these occasional missteps. One of the most obvious is that love taps occasionally kill the player. Just a tip, alright? Ah! There's a feeling of inconsistent damage, and the takedowns can be a little bit roughshod. The angle of what gets the shit stick sometimes is a complete coin toss, especially for the bikes. I don't mind all that much, or even especially care, simply because it removes a little bit of the unpredictability. But there's certainly a case to be made that this was not what they intended. Sometimes the game doesn't even show the wreck cams. It's like it knows some of this shit is busted. Some of that isn't too aggravating on its own. All the vehicles are very responsive. The game says the weather effects change the handling, but really? I don't know, I felt like this shit's just negligible. But again, specifically there are moments like the bike physics being unreliable, like there's no grip and they tend to spin out when landing a jump. The problem is this doesn't feel intentional, it feels kind of like a bug. And if it isn't an outright bug, it's simply unpolished. However, for the most part, the vehicles do feel really good. If they're not completely reliable, at the very least they're easy to pick up and play. The abilities are fairly distinct and do carve out a huge chunk of the moment-to-moment gameplay. They all have their own specific uses, but there is a noticeable issue with this when it comes to choice, at least in gameplay. At least a handful of abilities are designed with affecting players. A specific example would be the blinding trail in Blackout. These are effectively useless against AI. That's as well as simply lacking impact. More than anything else, with a game as violent as Onrush, why would I choose a vehicle class like this when I can just plow into something? That issue's all the same because across the board abilities just lack depth. Say Turbulence, the ability that pushes cars frankly off of the track. If both teams used this at the same time, handling from both could be counteracted. And with the aforementioned Blackout, if a player is blinded by the enemy and one of their own team members crosses in front of them with the same ability, it could clear the lens. But everything's a little bit too rigid in Onrush. There isn't a lot of experimentation, and that's probably its biggest issue. Onrush, a team-based game. My aching ass. It may be in principle, but certainly not practice. Tactical? Yeah, no. There isn't a considered response, like one's speed matching another's strength. Frankly, it's just a fucking free-for-all. And to be perfectly honest, that's a-okay with me. I am perfectly happy for it to just be a clusterfuck. But the game seems to insist that there's a little bit more than that. And I don't know, I just don't see it. Tactics? No bad choices means there are no tactics. The vehicles all have their own place, and that's cool. There is no choosing style over function or vice versa, because all of it's relative. When everything is available all the time, there's nothing to lose, and ultimately nothing to gain. Racing games are inherently repetitive, and even though this technically isn't racing, but I suppose angrily driving, basic action in this game is just very simplistic. For that, repetition appears quickly and heavily. And because the game is so mechanically simple, that aforementioned, what I'll term bullshit, begins to become increasingly aggravating. Frustration comes from playing more. It's not a given, but certainly common with almost any kind of game. Whether it's casual or of a serious action variety, Onrush rarely fits into either comfortably. And it should've. Over the years, I have seen vehicular combat done in some wildly different ways. In Onrush's defense, while simplistic, there are things done differently here, and even the things that aren't, are very fun. The issue is that the game needs an edge, just a little push further. I don't mean guns necessarily, but poking a sawn off out of a driver's side window. There are no projectiles or power-ups. There's not even a simple ramming feature. The thing about that criticism though is it almost doesn't matter. Onrush is more of an action game than MotorStorm. Wow. But the action is almost so constant that the rounds start to feel a little aimless. The action just doesn't have as much of an impact. The barrel roll in Pacific Rift felt incredible because it was never planned, at least on the game's end, or the game itself taking control. It was a shot in the dark and it felt incredible, or it was a happy accident. In Onrush, they happen so often that they feel a little too easy to initiate and land. This more precise feeling does bring it closer in line to something like, say, Burnout. But in Paradise, for example, this is healthily balanced out by the sporadic level design and, more noticeably, the game's overwhelming sense of speed. The game designers place a safety net below the player, but it's compact and it sits low enough above the ground to not be noticeable in the moment. Onrush simply isn't that fast, and despite all the explosions and pretty colors, there's not all that much going on. This could all be hand-waved away very quickly, however, by just a very simple statement. Onrush isn't trying to be a racing game first, it's trying to be an action game first. And that point is A1 fucking right. I would be perfectly happy to laud the game for that. But in considering that this is meant to be an action game, I have to hold it to the standards of one. And in doing that, I only find more problems. I'm gonna submerge myself in that fucking mire for a second, but it is gonna prove a point. A proper sandbox game, I'll choose one of the best. In this case, being Just Cause free, the game affords freedom purely through mechanics. It gives the tools, be it a constantly accessible grappling hook, or JC, a bomb. It then gives the playground, be it a simple occupied town or a sprawling mountain base. This is all class, but it purposefully gives the simplest objectives for the most amount of player expression. Shooting everything with a tank boring? Try something else. Take to the skies in the wingsuit and become a man-sized attack jet. This is what a fucking high bar looks like. The specifics in this case only serve as examples, because the broad principle underneath them all is not present, and for it, Onrush is not free enough. There is no experimentation, no specific role to inhabit, just a row of keys that all seem to play a very similar sounding note. There's no large choice, only necessity, and that's not player expression. There is a charm to knowing that I could be so good at the game that it's barely keeping up. Even to get only one glimpse of that during the entirety of the game's experience is enough to cement the game's worth. But with Onrush, that simply isn't going to happen, and the confines only appear in sharper focus when trying to find that limit. But the issue isn't so much the limit itself, rather it's how quickly it's found. The obvious solution to this is that Onrush is better enjoyed in a bite-sized capacity, and I actually do agree with that. Despite the similarities and the repetition, there is an obvious reason why I've played so much of this. That one note that all those keys play sounds real fucking sweet. So much of the game's development was primed on the idea of keeping the player in the action, and that is easily where Onrush excels the most. Not in the breadth of an entire experience, but within the joyful simplicity of the moment. Of course, On the Loose only lasts so long before we all need something to do. And as much as the main mechanical focus of the game felt like going room to room and mildly flipping over the tables, the events don't feel too much different. None of the event choices are particularly traditional, but they are distinct and help the game find a unique footing for itself. There are 4 events: Overdrive, Countdown, Lockdown, and Switch. Racing games can completely live comfortably within the space of one mode, so it isn't all that bad to know there's only a small number. There is effectively no story at all to think of. And it's very refreshing. To begin with the most emphasized mode, and probably the one that's closest to being the flagship, there's Overdrive. Get those points. Get more points. Those stars, get more of them. They turn blue yet? Pretty good. Just keep going. Easily the most broad of any of the events, because there isn't really a tactic to this. Wiping out an enemy racer will set them back a little bit, but for the most part, it's just about fucking beaming. And that, well, that's not too bad. Fill up the stars and don't boost in between rounds. It's not even necessary to be in first place. That to begin with is barely even a suggestion in this game anyway. It's just about keeping a score going. And that is exactly what I mean by broad, because my god is it so simple. Like, just for specificity's sake, not boosting in the air doesn't tick down the points. Just boost all the time. It's a blitzkrieg and a mostly very enjoyable one to boot. But what is seen is exactly what is got, and there isn't all that much beyond that. Second, there is Countdown. This is probably the most racing game style mode in the game, and whilst it isn't exclusive to my taste, it is probably my favorite. Like, I am not just saying that because I am a FUD. It fits the pace of the game so much better, hitting checkpoints in a game-decided route. It's simple, but it creates some very effective and enjoyable choke points between the races. Hitting each checkpoint adds a little bit more time. So, it's not about making the fastest time. It's about simply outlasting the game's mechanics. One round, particularly around the 30 or 40 second mark, will usually take the length of the track. And that's what I mean about it fitting the pace just a little bit better than any of the other modes. I especially like how it plays to the verticality of the tracks, as the routes change each time they're used. If I had one complaint, it would be that the mode is actually a little bit too easy. Once a checkpoint is hit, it's not like it disappears. If anything, actually, it expands outwards so more people can get it, and that just makes it a little too easy for that annoying sap at the back of the bunch. Like, look at him go. God bless him, he's still trying. Countdown though? Fucking A. For Lockdown, the game pushes a little further in the direction of an objective-based mode. A domination, as it were. This is all about the lockdown zone. One consistent circle, moving across every bump, every jump, every mouse, every house. I do not like green eggs in it. Fuck, it's fun and hyper-competitive. There's too much violence in the circle. Fuck it. Make it smaller. The thing don't drag its feet either, it fucking moves. The bigger vehicles tend to do better, but fuck is it hard to keep up sometimes. Another reason why that is because the zone itself drains the boost. And that's pretty fucking clever. It'd be nice to have a sort of gradual shrinking. Wait a minute, am I still talking about a video game? It'd be a little bit more fun, especially when the events start to drag on. Because for the most part, especially in between the events, there's just a little too much downtime. Hello, Doctor. Yes, I'm having problems with my zone gradually shrinking. Nevertheless, it's times like this when it really feels like the game was on to something. And although I wish they'd taken it a little bit further, for the most part, pushing the game just a little bit more has paid some fucking dividends. Finally, there is Switch. In theory, coming across as a slightly more complicated version of something like Eliminator, in practice plays a lot more like a sort of reverse gun game. This is probably the closest I ever felt the game revolving around that team-based idea. Starts small, ends heavy. Each individual wreck leads to the next in the 4 of the game's classes. To be the largest in this mode is to have already been the punching bag. Switch is fun. It's got easily the most amount of tension of any of the events. but it really does play into some of the more aggravating elements of the game's inner mechanics. Inconsistent damage and a shitty team AI really fails in a mode like this. The catch-up element is really fucking annoying, but every once in a while I noticed if I sat slightly behind the pack, that was the way of victory. You smell that, boys? That's Wensleydale in the air, for I have just identified the cheese. It's a decent enough time, but unfortunately a lot of the success does depend on how many curves there are on the track. A few too many, and the game just seems to think I'm much further behind than I am. Like, I am not a full lap behind, for fuck's sake. Oh, and I realize there's a reason why they don't show the elapsed time, because some of this shit is just so long-winded. Even more than me. Hey, all 4 of these events can be experienced in the championship mode, or as it is especially named, Superstar. There are multiple event seasons and they are neat enough. There are exclusive rewards and that's pretty cool, and a decent chunk of shit to do. I just can't shake the feeling, however, like this doesn't fit the game. And the reason I say that is because this is not Dirt 2. Onrush doesn't have customizable vehicles or deepened events or harder difficulties really. And these event seasons only highlight that there isn't all that much game to begin with. I don't mention Dirt 2 especially, but even something like Motorstorm Apocalypse and its 4-hour campaign seem to fit just well enough. Onrush is making a decent enough case, but I can't help but feel it's just kind of all the same. The game desperately needs some mini-games. I don't need to launch some fucking goober out of a cannon, but it'd be nice to do just a little bit more in this game. There's all this seemingly superfluous shit, like stuff to encourage player engagement, most valued players, and only fucking emotes? Like, I do not give a shit what my character looks like, let alone anybody else's. It could be this unwashed feline molester, or it could be cultural sensitivity training. I don't care, and I can't be blamed because simply, I'm only human after all. Like, there are even loot boxes. No, they're not that bad. I was constantly getting them at each new level. The rewards were mostly dreck, but there was some nice shit. Any skin or whatever can be bought with gold. And I don't think premium currency has ever been worth less. It's a dumb fucking trend, but it's so utterly ignorable that I don't know, I don't even know why I mentioned it. Some shit from the Superstar mode can be earned, and that's better than nothing at all. I will get to it. But the animation of opening the boxes is pretty nice. After all, one of the only things we can hope for is the animation of opening the loot box any good, and yeah, that's not bad. There are 2 types of challenges in the game. One's a lot more passive in nature and designed to get these sort of banner-looking things, usually quite long-winded. The other are specifically tied to the Superstar events, and these ones usually aren't too bad. Well, they can fluctuate in difficulty quite wildly, like some are just a pushover and can be easily done. Some that are actually quite nice are the Weekender challenges, and they're a lot better because they're a little drawn out, but breezy. It is for once about doing it at the player's pace, and for that it works out quite well, because there isn't that much weighing the player down. Oh, but they know how to be mean. They know how to throw something at me that just doesn't work. One specific challenge, and it is just awful. That is one with at least 3 switches left. It is painfully long, and highlights so many of the game's issues. The bad AI, the inconsistent power levels, and the limited player choice and expression. It also proves that catch-up system is fucking broken and unfair in a very obvious way. This one corner, fuck me, relying on the friendly AI to protect me is like asking a bonobo not to throw his own shit. That is 15 minutes of my life just gone. Oh, and the real strawberry on the shortcake? They don't even ask just once. Thankfully, for what little left there is of my sanity, there is some fairly minor event customization. Visual, more aesthetic features like changing the weather or the time of day, but more importantly, gameplay changes. entering certain class restrictions like bikes versus tanks. New form of masochism, or maybe not that new at all. This highlights the class balance well enough anyway, and makes for a nice change in the formula. I'm being too nice, it's time to complain. Why would I change the fodder count? It's intrinsic to the game that I have to take these fuckers out specifically to gain boost. When I take all of them away, it's not doing anything but making it worse on me. It's just making the game less enjoyable. Like, the difficulty here has no bearing whatsoever. It's an utterly pointless change, and I don't even know why the game would acknowledge it. In fact, the difficulty is one of the biggest fucking problems with the progression. Proper difficulty is defined by real increasing challenge. It's relatively simple shit, or at least I thought, because here it's defined by making the team AI more stupid. It isn't just exclusive to the friendlies, but the enemies too. It's not enjoyable to realize I'm not winning because I'm trying. Instead, it's because the adversary isn't. I could keep it 100 every time I enter a new race, but getting to that sparkling wine and hand job at the finish line seems to be very fucking arbitrary indeed, if it ever happens at all. Like, what miserly motherfucker is sitting in the background just deciding this ain't my day? The puck's a tiny field goal in the wrong fucking box, and that frustration is only exacerbated because there isn't really a definitive game mode. Like, Overdrive is kinda put first, but for the most part, none of these really take the cake. They all play well, and it's not like I dislike any of them, and I can't lie, I enjoyed all of them to a degree. It's that there isn't a center, and none of these change the mechanics enough to really be their own thing. Lockdown puts a limit on boost, Countdown puts a limit on the track, and Switch puts a limit on the player, but none of them are a completely unique experience when compared to each other. Sometimes it's just a dapper looking hat. There ain't no rabbits to pull out of it. Tracks, maps, environments, locales. There are plenty of words to use, but if they want to be considered in the vein of a fighting game, I guess I'll just have to try to call them stages. Across a reasonably large selection of tracks, the game doesn't make too many mentions of consistency, at least not when it comes to mechanics anyway. To begin with the most basic of itemization, however, there is Blast Pit, Glory Dam, Osprey Park, Freight Yard Forest, Stargaze Peak, Volcano Lake, Sanctuary Shore, Big Dune Beach, Lynx Bay, Whitewater Canyon, Crimson Base, Red Rock Refinery, Smith Bends, Cascades Way, Jadora, and Araku. Despite what problems will come to pass, designing stages wide and lengthy enough to suit the different sized vehicles, and more importantly, each individual mechanic each vehicle carries with it, the tracks... Fuck, I did it already. The stages impress because it simply works so well. The stages do feel incredibly similar, however, and the broadness of the vehicle's mechanics really exasperates this. Having 8 individual vehicles with their own abilities each, and finding a place for that to fit, is not an easy task, but the game has done it very well. If anything, the trade they've settled on was a good call to make. After all, the stages can only be used one at a time, whereas the vehicles are a constant stretching across the entirety of the game. Usually following a structurally clear free-lane design, the retreaded ground can be felt but rarely seen. I should have taken more notes. This game's full of them and it's bad. For the most part though, Evo have pulled it off. There aren't any sprint stages, and it's understandable as to why, as they'd be way too difficult to do. The game's pace just simply wouldn't fit. That being said, the game does tend to waste its scale a little bit. The clearest example is the dam, as it's simply too short. Now it is pretty cool because there are 2 different sections that are experienced in different ways. The problem is that it's just not all that mind-blowing. It's not a holy shit, so ambitious moment. It has the opportunity to be this incredible narrow rat race, but instead they choose to go for something just a little bit more basic. For that reason, areas around the dam and even the dam itself blend together. It plays well enough, good even. This one little toilet bowl is hilarious, but the stage doesn't feel special. In general, stages are noticeably static. Flattening a row of golf carts is a lot of fun, but there isn't much destruction, aside from what's done to each other anyway. I'm a basic guy, I just need a couple more destructible walls. Maybe even some that can only be destroyed when using the rush ability. There aren't any real interiors, usually only coverings. It does make sense though, because crushing whoever's below is a lot easier. There are some well appreciated, small areas to learn. Finding a corner to cut for the perfect T-bone takedown, or checking someone out into a string of trees. It is a lot of fun, and is easily the most rewarding aspect of the tracks. Most of the time, however, just learning where others are more effective on the track so as to avoid them is where the stages really excel. A lot of chances can often not be worth taking in the face of another long respawn timer, but regardless, that risk is exciting no matter what. The stages do just need a little bit more going on though. The game could just do with a few set pieces. The non-superfluous variety anyway. That crashing starship is cool as fuck, but nothing's really altering the track. Now Evo have pulled this off before with absolute aplomb. But here, vehicles are the only thing moving, at least the only thing that matter anyway. The stages added later in a free update do seem to have a little bit more going on. It of course makes sense because the game's been out a little while, but I don't necessarily think it excuses the basic feel of the rest of the tracks. Not that I'm usually in favor of reusing any more scrapped shit, but the conceptual artwork for Motorstorm Apocalypse had these floating tracks suspended from helicopters. To me, that idea fits perfectly in a game as irreverent as this one. I will say though that the game made me feel oddly nostalgic, harkening back to a simpler time, when tracks had to be simple due to system limitations. The basic, very PS2-esque, obligatory to-do list of desert track, or of course, forest track. I don't know if it's an all that accepted thing to appreciate, or even that it should be appreciated at all. But at the very least, they do look very nice. And the small twists, like an Old West ghost town seemingly undergoing an interplanetary invasion, add a little spice to the game and personality. An ancient Greek town or a placid volcano. And of course, hello America. I'm running on the platform. There should be more ski lodge levels in racing games. Thank you very much. I mean, Arctic Edge was set in the snow, and even that one didn't have a fucking ski lodge level. A variety in mechanics, but a variety in visuals? Sure. It's not even to say that the overarching variety between the tracks, or the lack of it, is based on anything bad, because that original design is actually really fun. The corners are absolutely fucking terrifying and enough to put shit in anybody's pants. Tapping the brakes whilst going round and seeing everybody else wreck and ball each other is a stern reminder that if there is only one goal in the game, it's usually a violent one. That violence does carry the experience. But there are moments, brief moments, where there just simply ain't that much going on. And in those very brief moments, it's like drunkenly stumbling into a public urinal and pulling down old Levi Strauss so Prince Albert can do his job. I come to the crushing realization that I have, in fact, in this process, overestimated my ability. I've pulled the jeans down too far and fully exposed my bare ass cheeks. It's of course not quite as embarrassing as fully dropping trowel, but it is of course uncomfortable enough to know that anybody saw it at all. And though it may be vaguely humorous, it's the second-hand embarrassment that hurts the most. Suffice it to say, that is what a lull feels like in Onrush. But leaving that lull and returning to the action, or rather vacating that bewildered restroom, and assimilating back into a crowded bar. This analogy has gone on far too long, and this severe and continuous lapse in judgment has left me feeling very depressed. One thing that doesn't, however, is the moments of driving through the chaos. Crazed bullshit in this game is the norm, but every once in a while, it's noticeable when it gets cranked to 11. Even if it feels more like the level designer is doing me a solid than actual genuine skill. The feel of getting a string of takedowns and a choke point just never gets old. One special place in this game's level design is in its use of verticality. Even if areas with higher ramps play noticeably slower and ground out relatively quickly compared to others, it doesn't change that this sense of design would put most racing game level designs to absolute shame. And as mentioned previously, although the game can occasionally waste its scale, when it doesn't, it's absolutely staggering. when the stages play into the differing tiers and levels, crossing over, under, and around each other, it's like going to one of the world's best water parks and seeing all those flumes doing just the same. General terrain can usually be pretty smooth, but a pothole once in a while pulls a really nice trick of throwing the player off just a little too much. There aren't completely differing routes, as this is still a deathmatch after all. When stages are at their best, they feel like a broad three dimensions, fully stretching forward. And although they can feel very similar, that isn't to say there aren't a few greatest hits. The large climbing bank on Araku that just seems to add a little bit more flavor to the action, or the downhill slalom and the subsequent darting between the rocks of Sanctuary Shore. For only a few problems, there is a lot to enjoy, as the vehicles are noticeably mechanically distinct. That is the half between the vehicles and the stages clearly takes the precedent and is the predominant choice within gameplay. Whether stages were kept within their own mechanics anyway, simple to ensure the game wouldn't be overwhelming, or just that they weren't the priority in design for the team, doesn't change how basic they can feel. The built-in barrel rolls and jumps are about as far as the immediate stage mechanics go. And whilst the stages could be considered a little bit too mechanically plain, more than anything else, and overall, I think the stages do their intended job admirably. I enjoy Onrush quite a bit, but fuck me if it ain't difficult sometimes. Most evidently is that Onrush never really seems to find its sweet spot. Playing too little feels inexperienced, playing a lot feels repetitive. I can't say that, hour 4 is where it hits its stride. Early hours are certainly better, but the game isn't mechanically dense enough to stretch over the hours in which it asks to do all this crazy shit. But on the reverse, the game isn't easy enough for that brief fun. Even the rounds themselves never find a solid fit between elongated and short. The game has no priorities when it comes to player engagement. The lengthy challenges certainly seem to imply a healthy commitment from the player, but the game just doesn't seem to have all that much going on to support that. Events feel weirdly aimless. Not enough intentioned violence, which don't add up for what's being asked. Just drive fast, just slow down, just don't die. I think it's pretty clear that there needs to be more consequence. Or if this still has some vague recollection of what a racing game is, why not eliminate it? Or, and this is really pushing the boat out from the dock, but if it wants to be like a shooter, why not team deathmatch? It's perhaps that they didn't want to be so obvious, but these are staples for a reason. That doesn't much help, because I can't shake the feeling that the so-called team-based racer might have just worked better as a co-op racer. This is all worsened by the fact that there is no split-screen co-op. I'm aware it's a different generation and subsequently a different time, but there's a reason this idea defined a generation of games that simply didn't have all that much multiplayer to begin with. I'd be willing to forgive it in certain respects because this is certainly not a traditional racing game. But where is the player engagement? Where is the sense of community between other players? And this sounds very harsh, but the free-to-play idea is written all over this game. Despite the loot boxes, emotes, callouts, and MVPs, the idea of free-to-play just never materialized, even though everything else speaks to it. And that is, I wouldn't call it a crying shame, but what happened? Because between everything that's going on, it seems strange to say that it's got all these features, and it's not to sound ungrateful when I say that that's it. Because although Onrush has its problems, not with what it has, which is quite good, but rather what it doesn't, it's difficult to demonstrate just how shapeless the experience can truly be. And before I venture further, I suppose I should take a slight detour to address the Motorstorm question. The games are different and there is no need for comparison. But it's clear, MotorStorm and Drive Club were very certain games. Onrush may have more genre bending, as it were, and, at least in principle, may even be the most creative, but it simply does not equal a better game. Onrush is a lot of good things, but the reason it never reaches its peak is because it doesn't even know what that peak looks like. Some ideas might have been folded over, especially with ideas that were never truly brought to fruition, like Evo's previously cancelled Urban Smash. For the most part, Onrush feels like a heavily isolated game. Just a little bit more structure, just a little bit more focus. Because as good as originality is, it only goes as far as its delivery. I'd never seek to lambaste them for making a different choice, and I am absolutely not going to lambaste them for making this game. Because ultimately, in the presence of a fair amount of bullshit, all of it falls in the face of this game's multiplayer functionality. This would usually be the point for some searing rant about the state of longevity with these kinds of games. But for once, I can't really take it seriously. And, as bad as it is to say, I just find it funny. Because it isn't just cutting out a certain portion of the game. It is the game. In terms of sheer functionality, it is just the campaign, the custom games, and more or less the options menu. Everything from the so-called loot boxes to just leveling up a player, all connected to a multiplayer. And it's very much funny in purely a baffling kind of way. But there are so many reminders in this game, whether it be seeing other races' vehicles, to just the menus, and the emblems, to seeing the player banners, and the level of customization. It's clear that this was a huge consideration, that this was a point they wanted the player to take pride in. And so, to see it just gone, it's just funny. Funny to see how shafted the game feels. All this shit over here is just gone. And there's no kind of replacement for it. There's no kind of equal or slightly matching experience. It's just gone. And in most other games, I would find this absolutely obliterating. But the unseriousness design of everything makes it feel more like water on a duck's back. Like, who really gives a shit? Is anybody buying these microtransactions? Is anybody obsessing over reaching 400 takedowns of a particular vehicle? And it is so baffling to see a game that at least expects a player to invest a hefty amount of hours for so little to reach when they get there, or even along the way. And of course, it isn't like they're holding back vehicles that any invested player would love to experience. It's just all this superfluous shit that the base game experienced at hour 0 is all that's going to be experienced throughout its longevity. And as much as this is a better way to do it instead of the pay-to-win pitfalls as they were, it just makes the game feel very empty. And to top that off, I just still cannot believe this was launched as a fully priced game. In the Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network era of, say, 2011, this would have fit in snugly as one of those cheaper, more condensed experiences. In fact, as the years would roll on, it may even be considered something of a misunderstood classic, at least by the standards of 2018. But for what it is, the feeling can't be escaped that Onrush just feels like a really fun mess. I don't necessarily know who exactly wanted it to be this way, but I'm confident there's not one single person who had this particular prospect in mind. Aesthetically, Onrush cuts a broad frame, with heavily saturated fluorescent gradients and blaring music to carry the action. Despite the overall violence of everything, stylistically, it is somewhat child-friendly. But that isn't a bad thing. Broad, yes, but certainly not completely juvenile. Intent can often be hard to nail down, but it's clear that this is a more liberally minded art direction. I do wish the game could pick a lane, as it were, but many of the stylistic crossovers are quite fun. Drive Club's engine was crafted from the ground up by Evolution Studios. Despite its beauty, shockingly, it was only used just once, with the legal parameters being held by Sony and the necessity for a new engine. It was an unshakingly high bar to overcome. With that being said, it is no small feat that Codemasters' own Ego engine is truly an impressive piece. Graphical fidelity is not only matching but also besting an industry standard. That, however, is somewhat of a half-truth itself, as this game is running on a heavily modified version of the Ego engine. A multi-platform release with consistent 60 frames per second and more particle effects than the open firework fiasco. It's a testament to a team that going from the earliest concept to this within 2 years is truly some technical wizardry. The 4 different seasons, as well as the additional blizzards and fog that coat the landscape. An incredible degree of environmental detail for a game where nothing's ever in focus or frame long enough to even be noticed. But one thing that's always at the center of screen are the vehicles, and they've been spared no expense either. Inner moving parts and glowing dashboards, set inside a casing that can effortlessly be turned back into tinfoil at any point. Brief loading times and a simplistic photo mode, all working in service to reach just beyond a heightened reality. It's an esteemed technical showcase. And whilst the last thing this game could be considered is understated, I was still finding, after plenty of hours, a surprise in the technical artistry of what's on display. It is a feat. However, Onrush's attempts, at least from what I can tell, are to cut a clean image. White text atop every color under the sun. It isn't noisy because there's a lot of grit or texture, and especially not because it's pixelated. It's noisy because it's just so fucking bright. Like, I'm trying to be polite, but this main menu is pretty fucking harsh looking. That's certainly not exclusive to the menus either. Some areas within the actual game, especially darker ones, it is just so fucking hard to see. The rush abilities certainly bring along with them a lot of emphasis and power, but there is sometimes so much shit on the screen, it is hard to see anything. The game's pace is consistently frenetic, and despite the gameplay itself possibly being considered overwhelming, by far and away the issue that compounds all of this the most is the bloated UI. In general, I do prefer fewer HUD elements. So much of the gameplay is moment to moment, so why does this shit need to be plastering the screen, and if it does, why does it need to be so big? The team icons and the takedown indicators that pop out. It's so needless. Why has it got to be so large? And if there's an optional scoreboard anyway, why does this need to be at the top of the screen at all times? I can understand that it's hard to convey this kind of information without doing something like this, but there must have been a better way, and at the very least, a lot of this could have been optional. The critical health filter is just a little too much. Sure, it's meant to be dramatic, it's the bloody screen, so real equivalent, but come on fellas, tone it down a bit. There's also a few notes that just make the game feel a little too easy. Like, all of the fodder have a white outline, and it's nice enough. It fits the visuals reasonably well. And it's the same for the enemy. Like, they've already got the big fucking icon floating over their head. Like, why do I need to have an outline on them as well? Am I somehow going to miss this? Then again, there's so much shit on the screen that maybe I would. So much is happening at all times that it might just completely wash over the player at a certain point. And that, unless they're gonna completely go back to the drawing board, is a very difficult issue to fix. It makes an experience that's reliably simple overly complicated. It's not just needless because it looks distracting, it's needless because I've played the game enough to know better. It is, however, by no means game-breaking. There are some lovely touches that prove useful. The cameras are fixed well and relatively smooth, jostling slightly like the landing of a jump. The takedowns shake the entirety of the screen violently in a very enjoyable way. This is a point where the game could have proved to be very distracting, but here, it remains quite fitting. That also ties in to how takedowns are visualized. Fodder crashes or takedowns are definitely less pronounced. On the reverse, racer takedowns are verifiably more spectacular. This plays into the mechanics but it's also just really fun to watch. Oh yes, the crash tag designs that are visible in these takedowns, always really nice to see. They're sprightly, fun and varied, plenty to take note of and appreciate. After all, graphic design is my passion. I just can't go away. In fact, whilst the crash tags themselves might be the easiest place to spot a lot of this artwork, there is a healthy amount of asset reuse. Some are on the higher end vehicles, but a lot more adorn many of the character designs, and they themselves are neat enough. Amidst this motley crew, at the very least, is a baseline sense of humor that does help to set them apart. And as much as I have relentlessly harped on the emotes, at least most are unique to each character. What year is it? About the only place where these characters differ in gameplay, at least minorly, are the air tricks that can be performed on a bike. They can be fun, they can break the laws of physics, and alright, and this badge you cannot change. Sure, this is done to earn points, but it's a lot more effort than they needed to go to. And while soaring above it all, it's a really good time to take note of that long ass draw distance. It's shit like this that, whilst often unspoken, end up being a clear indicator of the expanding horizons of modern hardware. And the stages themselves just simply aren't a slouch. Long foliage and iridescent waters. There's an awful lot of care for a game that really didn't need it. It's difficult to even find a time to appreciate this to begin with. And yet, that's nothing to the unique buildings and the incredible background details layered on top of that beautiful skybox. Even if they have a tendency to play the same, I can be certain that not a single one looks the same. They take advantage of the color in a gratifying way. The vehicles, steeped in an array of visual detail and a wide palette of colors, there's more than enough to appreciate for anybody. But there's one quite specific but nevertheless large problem. The designs speak very little to gameplay. Oh sure, I can read the names and see the icons, and I'm definitely going to be able to tell what's a bike and what's a truck. But is this a Titan or an Enforcer? Is this a Vortex or a Charger? There are some unique designs, and I would overall say they're pretty inoffensive, but there's rarely a silhouette strong enough to differentiate not the 8 classes, but the 4 broader ones. I like that a lot of them are one-seaters, that's certainly something interesting, but this is definitely a case where less is more. Still, there are a few personal favorites. Yeah, the artistic intent is all over the fucking place. And yeah, it's very visually loud. But despite that broadness, strangely enough, the thing Onrush lacks the most in its image is spontaneity. Because after a while, this just becomes a bit repetitive. And at times, it can just really feel like a optical malaise. It's not wholly memorable, but it's by no means bad. Most of the game, just on a base level, registers. And there are even times, like when the sun is hazed behind a fog, where it feels really tangible. And I think that might be the larger problem. All of it is so broad and so loud, it never finds a place to just sit down and take it all in. That is not the pace of the game, of course. There's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes, it can just be hard to see the forest through the trees. Time to shift the gear. The sound of Onrush speaks far better to both the gameplay and the appearance of quite a broad game. Initially, it appears as if the vehicles themselves don't sound particularly powerful and get lost in the mix. In fact, a lot of things do. But the more and more I played, the more I realized just how much was being controlled as I was playing. Why I think this works is because the game is never afraid to just build towards its action. That at first seems a little confused, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. This is effectively a game with constant action. There is no real downtime, and even the rounds themselves begin with a rolling start. Audio is basic. Music is much more prominent, yet both blend very well to make a unique auditory experience. It is, more broadly, a soundscape than the emphasis being placed too heavily on one or the other.
Other vehicles using their rush can be located by the thumping music blaring out the back. It's very cool, but more importantly, a great indicator. It applies pressure, whilst ensuring a player's attention. The music is edited remarkably well, climbing and falling to what's happening on the screen. Towards the end of a round, the music begins washing out to heighten the tension. All of this displays just a slightly higher level of care than most games. The sound can be small or large, and it never finds much reason to sit in that middle ground. This, for the nature of the game, was an absolutely superb decision. Whether it sounds basic or detailed, they found a way to make it their own. Easily, the most impressive example is the use of Rush. Slamming that button and getting that launch into the full-on diaphragm scream. It's strange and bizarre, and I love every second of it. It ain't quite the serum falsetto of Rob Halford, but damn if it doesn't add so much personality. Just seeing how long it can be extended is a micro game in of itself. It's loud and ridiculous and perfectly exemplifies the action that the game needs. But much smaller than that is a level of work that is just as, if not more so, impressive. For that consideration, there are the call-outs. Functioning as either a punishment or a celebration. The sources they are pulled from and the broadness of their sound fits the diverse action experience of the game beautifully. There's quite a long list, and in construction, they're very reminiscent of the sampling heard in hip-hop. It's a well-earned victory, or salt in the wound.
Come in, can you hear me?
And for all... Wait a minute. No.
You can't handle my strongest potions.
No. Stop the tape. What do you want me to do? I'll just unplug the fucking thing. It's stuck. It's not coming loose. It's a fucking cable, not a butt plug, so pull it out your ass. The song choices themselves find really good footing by being just as broad as the rest of the game. There's a stillness in the menus and an expected action in game. In a time when Need for Speed seems to only think there's one genre and it's middle-of-the-road hip-hop, it's nice that there would be so many choices in this game. Many come by way of Ninja Tune. There's a typical grating car ad radio rock, but nothing ever sticks around long enough to get all that repetitive. The highlights being Giraffish or Odessa. It comes together because it never treats a genre like a score, merely a moment. It's a damn shame this current generation's so fucking preoccupied with using gimmicky bullshit. Fuck, I'd love to put my own songs in this game and have them remixed. Cause, wow, there are so many choices. Shake Your Coconuts by Junior Senior with the ooh, ah, and the Coco Boys. I don't know, maybe it's just like Worms 3D nostalgia. Candy Paint by Post Malone. I don't know, it's a nice song. And Run Riot by Def Leppard. I'm shocked this hasn't been in like an action racing game at some point because it just seems to fit the pace so well. Like I can just picture those downhill sprints and sort of leaping through the air and that sort of tiered track design, like some really wide stairs going down. I don't know what the fuck I'm on about anymore. That's one thing about the all-encompassing style of the game that really helps the creativity. It just lends itself so well to whatever the interests might be. I like a well-thought-out tone and an aesthetic that has a specific goal in mind, but I think just the song choices in the game alone is a perfect example of why this type of game could work. And if I'm gonna zoom back, way back, see all this from a bird's eye view, I can say the reason the presentation comes together resoundingly so is because the music, the sound, and the visuals all combine together so well. It's a combination that for a style of this game usually makes the experience feel a bit too fluffy or light. It's not seat of the pants, crazy or anything, but it's just sprightly enough to keep its idea concerned. It may sound slightly or greatly irreverent, and it is. It's a stream of neon wrapped up in a wild whirlwind. It's an aesthetic soup. Setting it off, watching, hearing it go. And with those sights and those sounds, it's definitely hard not to pay attention. I guess it's time to burn this disco out. Gravel is pretty good. It's a nice little weekend racer. Flat Out 4 is the Dirt series seems to stagger on, sometimes to a degree of success and other times not so much. WRC lives on with KT Racing and the games are pretty good. The Wipeout Mega Collection was a nice surprise. Baja came back. And I think this might have been the last call for any kind of MotorStorm return. That's a shame, but Forza Horizon is a titan of the industry. It's absolutely holding down whatever is left of arcade racing. And at least vaguely, there is still a need for speed. My point is, there isn't a whole lot of enthusiasm left. There is a safety and a predictability to this underexposed side of the industry. The now rounded corners of this genre could have been shared completely by a game like Onrush. Whilst what's the game and what's the game trying to be are two very different questions with two very different answers. Neither one comes with a whole lot of reason, and the intention seems muddy. The game is less action racing game and more racing action game, loosely anyway. It might just be semantics, and I suppose it is, but it's all how it's framed and which is working in service to what. A game like Trackmania found a niche and expanded it so much that it's almost only theirs, merely in principle at least, let alone construction. For Onrush, the delivery is scattershot, hitting most targets, even difficult ones, whilst missing the basic. In fairness, throwing shit at the wall is occasionally necessary, but when all is said and done, it's hard to avoid the smell of whatever's currently dripping from the sideboard. That is, it's actually kind of mean. It's eclecticism amidst simplicity. Eclectic in a showcase and variety to keep it fresh, and seeming simple whilst waiting for the player to find the depth beneath. Apart, I think the eclecticism and simplicity find success in their own ways. But together, I don't know if that gap is ever successfully bridged. I'll put it another way. Whatever passing resemblance or out of focus familiarity to the MotorStorm series, Onrush, for the sum of its parts at least, isn't all that comparable, and moments of slight deja vu may only highlight the broader differences between the two. And because, for all the class-specific powers, unique events, and meaningful vehicle roster, ironically, the game is a noticeably smaller experience, and despite its often time-obstructing challenges, it's brief. Brief, but certainly not lean. It asks a lot in terms of player engagement, with a very seemingly small amount of recompense. Drive Club was a sort of melancholic swan song for Evolution Studios, an unintentional but nonetheless meaningful farewell to arms. For as bittersweet as the ending was, this makes Codemasters something of a pseudo-after-credits stinger. And as much as it might seem like a good time, I don't believe any party involved would have really want what eventually happened. The game had surprisingly positive reviews. Not surprising because I think the game is bad, I don't. Surprising because in almost every regard, the review industry isn't exactly positive to games that try anything new. Those deserved good graces did not contribute to sale. There is no polite way to say that the game flopped. And sadly, it is no surprise. Onrush is whack. There is no doubt this is a very difficult game to communicate to any kind of audience. But as much as it's hard to market a game like Onrush, it doesn't change the fact that Codemasters, as a publisher, barely put anything out there. Unceremoniously shoved out the door, and then a rather succinct waiting round to die. Whilst cutscenes like Onrush is here to stay appear in the least ironic and at most awkward, and the PC version of the game just outright never happening, it would be relatively easy and even somewhat understood to just disregard the game as another industry dud. But it just isn't that simple. Evolution supported the game with small fixes and small additions. They had a care for the game and the audience. But there's a reason this is a tale and not just another diatribe. The severe underperformance led to severe repercussion.
The layoffs hit sharply, with many of the in-house heavyweights being taken out of commission, and even the game's director being axed altogether. Brutal, drastic, there are many ways to describe it, but the most simple, and maybe even the most effective way, came in an anonymous source in an article by Eurogamer, in which they described, and I quote, the studio as having been decapitated. I suppose this shifts the gears of Evolution Studios' story from being a sort of biblical downfall to more of a Greek tragedy. I don't know the difference between the two, as I can't read. Perhaps a cautionary tale for some, but hardly an encouragement for damn near anyone left. And this could be a point for the more conspiracy-minded to spin a yarn how this may in fact have been the plan all along. Mayhaps I be one of those people? I'll never tell. But I don't need to drag the skeletons out the closet for a predictably shady company like Codemasters. Because as shitty and shady as they are, this isn't about them. It's about these folks. For a group of people who made something out of what could be considered desperation, or what I choose to believe was pure creativity. They gave it their all, and they ultimately paid for it. Twice. There are these games. They don't have to be racing games, but they appear as a flash in the pan, an outlier in their particular genres. Sometimes successful, sometimes not. No matter what, the games end up being memorable, bringing together mechanics from different genres that, whilst it might not be wholly original, it can still be a unique experience. It's a lonely game, not left entirely to its own niche, and not sharing the glory with others. It could be considered sad. However, that's why this all works. None of these ideas are exclusive. All of this has been seen and done somewhere else. But that isn't an indictment. No, that is a celebration of what might just be game's most raw genre. And the fact that this game could even be considered a racing game is a testament to the beauty of this genre. Because when I said that everything in this game could be found somewhere else, I might have just lied. Onrush excels in the moment, and that absolutely has to be reiterated. And the manner in which this game keeps the player in the action is an undisputed breakthrough. For all the rough edges, it is simply outstanding. There is just something to be said of a game that completely engrosses in its moment. Relatively simple fun is enough, and at its best, Onrush is perfectly happy to speed away as the player grins in the driver's seat. Are the good times really over? Maybe, Mel. Maybe. But we don't have to let the tape outrun us just yet. What comes next? Not my business. I don't know much, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's that there's still a lot of wonder to be found in Legacy. It might be a championship. It might be a storm. Might even be a club. Maybe, just maybe, I'll be out there in the Stampede.
Baby, on that hot summer night, I was so hot for you, you were nowhere in sight. You thought I was fooling, so your heart took the flight. I guess we're star-crossed lovers, we just can't get it right. 2 years later, I was out on the town. I saw you on the street and my heart hit the ground. I guess love is like a chain, and you're always bound. Star-crossed lovers, we just can't